But first, it's often said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Now, in politics, as in life, failing to learn from your mistakes or the mistakes of others only ever ends badly. And sadly, ending badly is where the Morrison government is headed if it embraces net zero by 2050, as some of its MPs are demanding. Without knowing the price Australia would pay in terms of jobs and economic prosperity. National security too, given how rapidly we're disowning our resource exports and losing our heavy industry just at the time China is expanding theirs. On issues of the environment, for too long, the left have tried to paint the right as pariahs. But the very essence of conservatism is the fundamental belief that there's things worth conserving. All of us should want to rest lightly on the planet, given it's the only planet we have. But there's a big difference between delivering practical environmental gains and using the environment as cover for wealth redistribution on a massive scale, socialisation or socialism by stealth, if you like, including and importantly, the deindustrialisation of the West. It's way past time to remember that we can hardly save the planet by destroying the economy in the process. Take Britain, for example. It's leading the charge on net zero because Boris Johnson wants his name up in lights when he hosts the Glasgow summit in a couple of months' time. In Britain, despite doing exactly what the climate alarmists think we should be doing here, and with roughly 40% of electricity already coming from intermittent wind and solar power, Britain have found themselves in an energy crisis. Given that modern life needs electricity 24/7, the problem for renewables is lack of capacity when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. Because you can't rely on renewable energy, the grid always needs to be backed up, mostly backed up by gas. And because the wind has hardly blown in Europe over the past month, and because Russia is playing games with the gas supply, prices are going through the roof in Britain and there's not much gas left in storage. Now, to compound these problems, there's been a fire in one of the interconnectors that usually gives the UK access to reliable nuclear power that supplies 70% of French electricity. The result? Factories are closed because the sky-high gas price makes them uneconomic, and millions of Britons are worried they won't be able to heat their homes come winter. This is now. This is today, before we even start to cost in the massive hit of extra net zero commitments. And on that, the taxpayer impact of these commitments, Britain's government-funded climate body called the Climate Change Committee, it's estimated that the net zero price tag is in the trillions, somewhere between 1% and 2% of GDP. In order to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, the committee says green investment would have to reach around £50 billion per year, 5 times what it was last year. They're just projections. Asked to put a specific tag on net zero by 2050 back in June, the UK's Treasurer equivalent, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, a smart man, degrees from Oxford and Stanford, well, he stumbled and fumbled.
Let's look at another promise that's going to cost you a ton of money, cost the British people a ton of money. The Prime Minister has pledged that we'll be at net zero on carbon emissions by 2050. But it's a promise without a price tag. How much will it cost?
Well, I think it's hard to put a specific figure on it.
It's reminiscent, isn't it, of Bill Shorten at the last election here in Australia, who never costed his policy to cut emissions by 45% within a decade because he insisted the cost of inaction would always be lower than the cost of action. Who could forget this election campaign exchange with now Sky News reporter Jonathan Lee?
When can voters expect to learn more about Labor's emission reduction target, how you're going to get there and the cost to the economy?
In the 2-minute answer that followed, not one reference to the emissions reduction target.
Question, Mr Shorten.
Okay.
politicians not answering the question they get asked can get frustrating.
I'm going to give someone else a go.
Answer the question. When can people know?
Dan.
When can people know, Mr. Shorten, the cost of the economy? You didn't answer the question.
Do you know what, John? I'm going to go to the next person.
No, you should answer the question. That's why we're here to ask questions, and you're not answering the question.
Dan.
When can people expect to know, Mr. Shorten, the cost of the economy?
All right, Dan.
Why can't you answer the question, Mr. Shorten?
Because I'm going to give your colleagues half a go.
No, because
Dan.
you should answer it. Why can't you answer the question, Mr. Shorten?
It was a large part of how Scott Morrison won that election. Labor couldn't counter the coalition's modelling, showing that a 45% cut to emissions would mean power prices 50% higher and wages $9,000 a year lower, with 336,000 few jobs by 2030. Now, if that was the damage done by Labor's 45% cut in emissions by 2030, what do you think the damage might be if the coalition signs up for a 100% cut? 100%, because that's what net zero implies, even if it's over a slightly longer time frame. And that's the issue, isn't it? No one can define precisely what net zero would actually mean, and no one will say what it will cost. Does it mean no more petrol cars or diesel cars, as it will in Britain by 2030? Does it mean an end to eating meat, given that cattle and sheep are responsible for about 10% of Australia's emissions? What about the practicality of charging electric cars, all of us on the grid at the same time, assume at night, and given that the sun doesn't shine at night, what happens then? Is Canberra too gutless to countenance nuclear power? Well, we heard the PM the other day rule it out when he brought in his nuclear submarines. Now, none of this has been thought through, except with all this vague talk of a bit of hydrogen and totally unproven technology, as you know, and backers this week are demanding $19 billion in subsidies, $19 billion in subsidies from the federal government, your money, before they'll even go down that path. The last thing Scott Morrison should want is to put himself into the same invidious position that Shorten was the last election, and he took full advantage of with a vague, uncosted commitment that will hit the Australian economy and households. After all, Morrison's only PM because his predecessor tried to pull one over the party room with an energy plan better suited to the Labor Party. While the other bloke before that, well, he took them from opposition to government in a landslide win, promising to repeal a carbon tax. Honestly, to paraphrase Paul Keating at another time in another debate, if you don't understand it, don't vote for it. And if you do understand it, you won't vote for it. That's where the coalition is at now. No coalition government worthy of the name asks its supporters to sign a blank cheque on green politics. If it's worthy and should be done, then tell us what it'll cost. If it can't be costed, if the hit is unquantifiable, then that in itself says everything. It's quite a watershed moment here for the Prime Minister and his government. The Liberal Party has always been at its strongest when it has used both its heart and its head to run the country. Now, there's plenty of climate emotion around at the moment, but not much in the way of economic smarts. And that doesn't change and change quickly. They can forget the next election.